In Dungeons & Dragons, Merfolk are a race of humanoids that live underwater. A Merfolk has the upper body, arms and head of a graceful, well-built and attractive humanoid with fine, fair and delicate features. And instead of legs, it has the lower torso and scaled tail of a great fish with a long tail ending in powerful fins that aid with their swimming. Adult mermen are between 5 and 6 feet long, from the tip of their head to the end of their tail, and weigh between 150 and 225 pounds. Though larger merfolk can come in about 8 feet long from the top of their head to the end of their tail, and weigh upwards of 400 pounds. Their hair and scales can be wildly varied, although usually within any one specific region they tend to resemble one another. Their skin tone is usually between fair and tan, although it can be deep, warm shades of brown, or lighter shades of tan and even gold, and sometimes even very pale tones such as peach and white. Their hair colour is usually dark brown to black, although it is sometimes fair. Their scales are iridescent and they glow. They are most commonly green, silver and shades of blue, usually reflecting the colour of the sea around them. And like a lot of fish, they have darker scales on their backs and lighter scales on their undersides, which helps mask their presence from creatures above and below them in the water. Ultimately, they can be just as varied in colour and culture as many of the humans and other races on the surface. The females of the species, known as mermaids, tend to be about 6 inches shorter than the males, and can be anywhere between 100 and 150 pounds for the smaller ones, and upwards of 350 for the larger ones. Both male and female merfolk like to decorate themselves with seashells, coral and other adornments that they find underwater or craft for themselves. The merfolk are usually neutral in alignment, and they tend to prefer to avoid combat. They concern themselves more with nature and art than they do with things like morality or ethical debates, and they do just tend towards the neutral alignment. And while they might work with surface races or other non-merfolk aquatic races on occasion, they usually won't trust their allies, and therefore these relationships break down quite quick or are only temporary in nature. Merfolk who adventure on their own usually only do so because there's nothing left for them in their homes, or they aren't welcome in their homes any longer. They're usually quite playful people, and although they're usually quite wary of creatures from the surface, they are not usually directly hostile. They prefer to kind of just chill on rocks and get a suntan on their upper parts, whilst keeping their lower halves in the water so they don't dehydrate. If possible, they try not to engage in actual warfare, although adventurers who do come across merfolk tend to become the victims of pranks and other playful mischief. Although the merfolk unknowingly, and whilst not actually evil, can be a little bit cruel in their pranks. For example, they may drag a humanoid underwater and watch them drown, thinking it's quite funny watching how pathetic they are in the water. Should someone from the surface react with aggression and do harm to the merfolk will fight back with some quite considerable strength. And although they are marine dwelling, they are still amphibious. They are still half humanoid. They can breathe both air and water, and they can travel on land, albeit very slow and very awkwardly. And just due to preference, they very rarely travel more than a few feet from the body of water that they actually came from. They were once upon a time humanoid and were transformed by some unknown powers into the merfolk form. This may have been many generations back, so no merfolk today are likely to remember being a different kind of humanoid. And it was probably an act performed by some deity. And as mentioned before, they do live underwater, but they do like to sun their humanoid halves on large rocks offshore. And if they can avoid it, they'll very rarely spend large periods of time with their entire body out of water, because they can survive out of water for some time, but they do begin to dehydrate, and when they dehydrate they start losing hit points each hour, and they will eventually die if they entirely dehydrate. Although they can immediately restore any hit point lost due to dehydration by immersing themselves or drenching themselves with fresh or salt water. They are incredibly skilled swimmers. They get a +8 racial bonus on swim checks in 3rd edition, and they could also take a 10 on a swim check no matter what at any time, even if they were distracted or under pressure or in combat. And they can also choose to take a run action so long as they are swimming in a straight line. Merfolk are omnivorous, meaning they can eat meat and plants and fish, but they personally prefer a diet of fish, lobster, crabs, and other shellfish. They do not cook them, but they have to remove the bones and shells. They can't crunch the bones and shells. That will cause them harm. And they have an average life expectancy of 150 years, so that's a trade up from your average humanoid. Merfolk speak their own language. They do have their own Merfolk language, although between each settlement that is separated by long distances, they'll have very different dialects and sometimes won't be able to understand one another between two separate places. And a lot of their communities also speak Iocatha, Common, and Aquan. Iocatha being a different racial language, and Common and Aquan being the two languages they encounter the most. Merfolk society is heavily patriarchal, meaning they are usually ruled by a single king. That doesn't mean there aren't Merfolk settlements with a queen or other type of structure, but for the most part they are usually ruled by a king. They prefer to be left by themselves and reject allegiance, friendship, or trade agreements with other settlements, including other aquatic folks. They are extremely territorial, and while they are closely related to the surface creatures, they give absolutely zero cares about them. The males of the species tend to be hunters and herders of fish, and they will also train as warriors. They'll patrol the edge of their territory and keep interlopers out. The females of the species tend to stay within the settlement and raise the children and tend to domestic affairs. Mermaids are also known for their creativity, and they produce works of art for the entire community. They will produce things like shell carvings, seaweed tapestries, and they will sing songs. Merfolk might experiment with a harp or a woodwind instrument, particularly if they just discovered one that had fallen off of a wrecked ship, or they might have stolen from a pier or from a seaside community, but for the most part they are very well practiced singers. Merfolk voices are capable of reaching tonal ranges that would make a human bard extremely envious, and they are capable of making their songs travel very long distances under or across the surface of water. So you could hear a Merfolk song from very, very far away, perhaps even further than you could see one from. On the rare occasion, a Merfolk community may exile a Merfolk who has broken the trust of his neighbours. So criminals or just liars or betrayers, someone who isn't faithful to their partner might get exiled from their community. But rumours do exist of Merfolk who get exiled from their community for no reason other than the fact that they lack musical talent. Some Merfolk tribes see the expression through music as a sacred ability to Merfolk, a gift given to them by the gods, per se. So to them, a Merfolk who can't sing, or one who sings badly, is cursed, destined to bring ill fortune on the entire settlement. Cursed Merfolk aren't driven out violently, they are gently but firmly turned away by their kin and forced to make their own way in the world. In the reefs and trenches near their settlements, Merfolk harvest coral and farm the seabed. They will shepherd fish, and just like land-based farmers might tend to sheep. During times of need, they are willing to turn to piracy. They will attack other seafarers or ocean-going vessels and just steal what they need. Merfolk lack the materials and the practical means to forge weapons underneath the water. They can't produce a flame, they can't produce a forge. They cannot produce paper, they cannot write books or keep magical lore or history written down, and they are unable to shape stone, so they can't build buildings very easily, and they struggle to build cities. Merfolk are among the best and yet least understood of the aquatic races. Folklore is filled with stories of merfolk, legends of beautiful merfolk falling in love with humans, or ship crews saved from storms by friendly bands of the creatures. Among land dwellers, merfolk are almost legendary figures of impossible beauty and magic. Starry-eyed mariners will tell tales of their romantic encounters with the creatures along the beaches of their coastal towns. However, landfolk and merfolk rarely meet except by pure chance. Merfolk are an extremely insular and guarded race. They are secretive and extremely prone to xenophobia. They value their privacy and are more likely to react to surface dwellers with aggression than friendship, and definitely as opposed to passion. Merfolk communities guard their territories ruthlessly. They may warn away ships and travellers who seem to have mistakenly come across the waters or seem to be genuinely lost. But if the trespassers seem to be armed or possibly hostile, the merfolk will attack first. They have many natural enemies, but in particular they hate Sahuagin, Ixyatl, and they often clash with Tritons over territory. Sahuagin and merfolk clash a lot. The Sahuagin have been known to destroy entire merfolk colonies and rarely take just a few survivors as prisoners. Merfolk share one thing in common with the Locathas. They revere the same deity, Edro, who created both races. As we discovered earlier, that merfolk were created by an unknown force. It was most likely the deity Edro. Most merfolk encountered outside of their home are usually warriors, as opposed to the singing maidens that people are familiar with from mythology. Merfolk communities tend to be well armed. They tend to use things like tridents, daggers, a specially customized crossbow, and perhaps even a javelin. They are also often armed with grappling hooks used to tip ships. So they will fling a grappling hook over the side of a ship and then use 10 merfolk warriors to pull on the same grappling hook. Done 10 times over, they can tip ships, slow them down, stop them in mid-waters, and then with a bit of time and a bit of focused attack, they will breach the hull and start sinking the ship, therefore dumping the crew into the water to drown and sending all of the ship's cargo to the sea floor where the merfolk can pillage it at will. For smaller merfolk communities, they will defend their communities with spears crafted from whatever materials they can salvage from shipwrecks, beaches, and dead undersea creatures such as tritons and sahuagin. As mentioned earlier, they have their own specialized crossbows crafted out of shell and coral, and the bolts are fashioned from blowfish spines, which have an underwater range increment of 30 feet and don't suffer from the usual penalties. And they will usually use these crossbows to barrage their enemies before tossing aside the crossbows and engaging with their tridents. And then should the enemy getting closer than the trident's range, they will resort to their daggers in a scuffle. It is notable that despite the ineffectivity of fire underwater, merfolk are particularly vulnerable to fire attacks. A typical hierarchy for merfolk will be a patrol group of around 20 merfolk, led by a patrol leader, and that patrol leader will have some trained barracudas. For every couple patrol groups, there is another leader that leads the multiple patrol groups, and then for every 6 patrol groups, there is a chieftain and 2 guards for that chieftain, and that will be the structure for most smaller towns of merfolk. 1% of merfolk trained in combat will develop into shamans or priests, although alongside these roles they are also usually very gifted musicians, so you'll also find a lot of bards, and because of their worship to Edro, merfolk clerics do exist. Merfolk clerics get access to the domain animal, protection, and water. Merfolk tribes and kingdoms are all around the entire globe. Most of them live in smaller tribes, just hunting and gathering the resources they need, or pirating what they don't have or can't get for themselves. Each individual tribe tends to hold up its own unique values and creeds, and their settlements tend to be only semi-permanent and tend to be located nearby to wherever they want to fish or hunt or gather. They will keep company with porpoises. They will keep them as pets and will keep them as friends. They are also notable to be friends with sea cows, which they will tend to farm as much as keep as a pet. Surface dwellers who come face to face with merfolk in the wild tend to do so with either a scouting party or a hunting patrol, and are nearly always entirely composed of warriors. They have regular undersea communities and are usually very hierarchical, usually ruled by a royal or noble family of some kind, or noble bloodline of some kind. And they will usually dig honeycombs of tunnels into reefs or the bottom of cliffs with tight passages that they can swim through and defend. They will build vast caverns and mazes out of these tunnels and out of coral, which they will cultivate and grow. They will sometimes take over the ruins of sunken cities, or they will make structures that they carve into the seabed, or they may take up residence in a sunken ship or other structure. They tend to live in water that is relatively shallow, enough that they can still see the sun and they can still track the passage of time that way. On the rare occasion they do venture down into the darker, deeper depths. Because they don't have dark vision, they have to rely on bioluminescent flora and fauna such as jellyfish. On the rare occasion, they will construct their entire village out of shells and coral, which the coral they cultivate slowly over time. An average community size is anywhere between 200 and 1,200 individuals large. These communities are usually somewhat guarded by numerous trained sea creatures such as barracudas or sharks or other aggressive or carnivorous aquatic animals. And only occasionally do merfolk actually unite under a single banner. They will usually come to the aid of their king and form as a kingdom, but only to do so if they have a common threat against them, or in order to complete conquest over other domains, in order to expand their own territory. So they will only fight for their own king should their settlement have a common interest. Although when they do unite as such, and their settlements become a unified kingdom, their dynasties can last hundreds and hundreds of years, which for merfolk is only a few generations. There are extra mentions of merfolk in the Dragon 250 issue, wherein they made a player race for the advanced Dungeons & Dragons game. They are also mentioned in Sea of Fallen Stars from 1999. The 5th edition Monster Manual also mentions the Mero, creatures that hunt in the coastal waters, and they will tend to prey on fishermen and merfolk and other what they consider edible sea folk, such as tritons or swahagan or anything made of meat. They are savage. They will willingly drown their victims and then haul them back to their grottos in order to eat them. They were long ago a tribe of merfolk who interacted with Demogorgon. Demogorgon allowed them access to the abyss and kept them trapped there for decades, and then eventually allowed them to go free, but they were twisted by the abyss. They were demonic. They aren't merfolk any longer, but they will willingly eat their kin. They will eat other merfolk raw, cannibalistic. They have a single king who still lives to this day, and they fight for Demogorgon. They will further his desire to destroy and consume and corrupt. They are entirely warped in physical and mental form, and they are hulking, evil monstrosities. They are bullies. They will terrorize settlements for no reason other than to terrorize them. Whenever they have the chance, whenever they can, they will wreak havoc in the oceans and on land nearby to the oceans. If a creature is smaller and weaker than them, they will attack and torture and kill and probably eat that creature. They dwell in similar settlements to merfolk, usually taken over from merfolk or other aquatic races, rather than structuring them themselves. And they will just take anything they need. They will keep gruesome trophies pulled from their victims, such as fins, heads, spines, bones, and they will litter them around their settlements. They will tie rotting corpses of their enemies up to posts and pillars and rocks in order to mark where the edge of their territory is. So Merrow are very, very bad news and are a terrible time for fishermen and merfolk alike. And so that is everything I have notes on. Hopefully that'll be useful to someone out there. If anyone wants me to go over a different type of race or creature, feel free to send me a message or comment and just let me know what you want me to cover next, and I will make my best efforts to get round to it and do so.